Hello, and welcome to this Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to take a look at wind power and ask the question, are we sailing towards clean energy or are we tilting at windmills? Now, when we think about the possibilities and the applications of wind power, we need to start out at a very basic level and think about how the movement of air, and basically wind, impacts us in a whole variety of different ways. On the left-hand side over here, we've got over here, so you can actually see it. We've got an example of a dandelion. This dandelion has been, flower has been pollinated. We've had the flower develop into kind of small fruiting structures. We've got seeds that are present here with then a modified kind of leaf-like structure kind of extending from that, a little almost like seed-like structure. So that when the wind blows, it's going to distribute these seeds probably all across your yard to get those weeds growing all over because the grass doesn't seem to be growing in some cases. From a recreational standpoint, over here on the other side, get this thing going. Over here on this other side, we're taking a look at kites. And so we can use air power, the movement of air, the wind, to lift objects, in this case from a recreational standpoint, take a look at it and the aspects of flying a kite. Now, wind and the movement of air isn't always beneficial. There are some, potentially harmful effects associated with this. So on this slide, we're taking a look at kind of the enhanced Fujita scale, or EF scale, which is used to measure the impact and force of hurricanes. And so, not hurricanes, of tornadoes. And so what we can see, there's a similar scale for hurricanes as well. So for the tornadoes, it goes from EF0 up to EF5. And so, at an EF0, you got to take a look at it. Relatively minor damage present, maybe a few kind of loose shingles across the roof, some branches down, kind of things like that. And it goes along with a wind speed of about 65 to 85 miles per hour. And they have, criteria that have to be kind of followed to this. The National Weather Service will go out and take a look at a region based on the extent of damage, kind of determine what was the level of hurricane being present. As we can see, as the level and speed of the winds increase, the power of the winds increase as well. So in EF1, you start to see kind of damage to the roof, and so sections of the roof, kind of being pulled off. EF2, actually kind of pulling down, pulling off the roof structure itself. EF3, taking a look at this, we're looking at more severe damage. And with severe damage, some walls from well-constructed houses are going to be torn away, get up here to an EF4, going to extreme damage, and then finally the massive EF5 tornadoes, where you're basically looking at incredible or massive catastrophic damage being present. So again, lots of different uses of air power, some for beneficial purposes, others for potentially harmful. And again, not able to control it in any way, but hopefully be able to kind of recognize the power that's associated with the movement of air, the power associated with the wind, and then figure out how to use that, or at least how to protect structures if we're taking a look at building houses that are going to resist the effects of these tornadoes or high winds. And so the basic properties of the movement of air are pretty simple when we take a look at the science behind it. Over here, we've got an example of a hot air balloon. And so, really nice, kind of taking off here. We've got a little burner here. In this case, we're probably looking at a propane burner. So propane tank here, kind of a little flame going off. You pull the lever and it shoots this big flame up here, heating the air. And so what we can see is that hot air rises. And so that causes the balloon to fill up. Sure I'm in the right area. The balloon to fill up with hot air. As that hot air is rising, it's going to displace the colder air, and so the hot air is going to be rising. The cold air is going to be flowing down. So, it works really well if we're taking a look at a hot air balloon. But how does it work in nature? What is causing the movement of air? What is causing wind to occur kind of on a planetary scale? Same basic idea. What we can see is that instead of using a burner and a hot air balloon, we've got the sun over here. And so the sun, as this massive source of energy, is going to heat the surface of the Earth. And as it's heating the surface of the Earth, this warmer surface is going to radiate the heat into the air. And that's going to cause the air to warm. And so as that air warms, much like the hot air balloon, that air is going to rise. And so what we're going to have is this situation where the hot air or the warmer air is going to be rising up, and it's going to leave a gap behind it. It's going to leave a space as that hot air is moving out, as it's rising up into the atmosphere. And so what happens, and again, if you watch the weather, when they describe, if you got highs and lows and all kinds of other things going on, what are they talking about? It seems to make sense to them, and it explains, at least, as accurately as they can, what's going on with the weather patterns in a region for, the next day or so. And so we take a look at it. If we've got the surface of the Earth heating up because of the sunlight hitting it, the air is rising. That's going to leave this gap behind. That gap where we're going to have kind of less, I want to say less air, but as the hot air is rising, it's going to cause lower pressure in this area, lower kind of amounts of air in that area. And that's going to be one of those low pressure zones that the meteorologist is going to be talking about on the weather on the evening news. So what's going to happen then, if we look at that hot air rising up, it's going to leave this kind of low pressure region, and cold air is going to flow in to fill that space that's left behind by the warm air rising. And that's going to contribute to the wind. And so if we take a look at that, kind of in an example, we can see a situation, maybe down at the Jersey Shore. You've got the land coming down, you've got the ocean over here, but we've got a situation where we've got land and water being present. And so we need to know the characteristics of heat impacting, the sunlight impacting on either the ground or the water. And so what we can see is that during the day, the sunlight is going to be hitting both the ground and the water, but the ground is going to be heating up faster. And so as that ground is heating up faster, we're going to see the situation that hot air is going to be rising. So hot air is going to be rising faster over the land than over the water. And so what's going to happen then is the hot air is going to rise. It's going to leave behind that low pressure zone. And so we're going to have a high pressure kind of up in the atmosphere, which we're really not going to be able to see because we're usually not up into the atmosphere. But we're going to have this low pressure area over here. And so we're going to have a sea breeze during the day. Hot air is going to be rising over the ground. The cooler air over the water is going to be flowing in. And so we're going to have the sea breeze, this cooler air kind of coming in from over the water, kind of blowing onto the land. Out in the water, where we're probably not going to see it, it's further out, so unless you're on a boat, you're probably not going to see it. That hot air rising over the land is going to go and flow kind of up in the atmosphere out towards the water area, out towards the ocean if we're looking at the Jersey Shore. And ultimately, it's going to fall down there because we're going to have this kind of circuit of air movement going on. Now, what happens at night? At night, we're going to see the situation where similar to during the day, during the day we said that the air, or at least the ground, is going to be heating up faster than the water. The inverse is happening at night. The ground is going to cool off faster than the water is going to cool off. So in that situation, the air kind of around the ground, the surface, the ground surface, is going to cool off, where the air over the water relatively is going to be warmer. And so the air over the water is going to be rising up. The air over here above the ground is going to flow out to the sea to kind of fill in the space that's left behind by that hot air rising. So in that case, we're going to have a high pressure zone in the area of the ground, and that's going to be pushing the air out to the low pressure zone over the water. And so we're going to have a land breeze at night as the air is flowing from the ground out over the water. And so that's interesting. We can see how that occurs. Go down to the Jersey Shore this summer and try it out. Look at where the air is going, where the wind currents are going during the day, and later in the evening. Probably not right at sunset, but maybe a little bit later. Let the ground cool off a little, and you can see the land breeze kind of reversing the direction of the wind at the shore. If we take a look at this at a much broader level, we can see the same thing occurring kind of along the surface of the planet. What we have is more intense sunlight at the equator, which is, make sure I get my pointer back, which is going to cause the air to heat up faster at the equator than it is kind of at the higher latitudes, kind of further away from the equator, closer to the poles. And so the same thing we saw going on at the Jersey Shore, where where the surface is going to be warmer. That's going to warm the air. That's going to cause the air to rise. And at some point, we're going to have a region where the air is going to be falling. And so in this case, we're going to have hot air rising at the equator. It's going to go up in the atmosphere, kind of move towards the higher latitudes, kind of further north from the equator or further south from the equator. And so we're going to see that moving up in the atmosphere. We're not going to see it on the surface, but closer to the surface, we're going to see the cold air kind of falling down at some point, kind of closer to the poles. Not all the way to the poles, but further away from the equator. And we're going to have this movement of air from kind of the higher latitudes back down towards the equator. And so we've got this movement of the air caused by the heating and cooling of the air and the production of wind as it flows from these high pressure zones to these low pressure zones. And again, the low pressure zones are going to be created as that air is warming and rising up. And so if we take a look at this, again, at a global scale, we're going to see that this normal pattern that's going to be occurring, so it's, we've stopped the Earth at this point, imaginarily, but basically hot air rising here at the equator, so we're seeing that occurring here, kind of going up in the atmosphere, but at some point that's going to cool down, and that cold air is going to be kind of falling down, and we're going to have wind going from north to south. As it's going from this kind of higher pressure where that cold air is falling towards the surface of the ground, and higher pressure at the surface where we are and where we're going to be able to measure it and recognize it, wind flowing down towards the equator, and that is going to be filling in this low pressure zone, and that low pressure zone is going to be occurring as that the surfaces are heating up from the sunlight, more intense sunlight at the equator, the air is rising, and so we've got that circuit. Now, we artificially stop the rotation of the Earth, but when we allow it to kind of go on, what we're going to see is that the rotation of the Earth, the Earth is going to be, spinning on its axis, causing the sun to appear to rise in the east and set in the west. Now, the sun isn't moving. It's actually the Earth is turning. And so as the Earth is turning in relationship to the sun, we're going to see that we're going to bend those kind of static currents we've got here. We're going to bend them. And that bending of them is going to cause for more global wind patterns. And so if we take a look at this, what we can see is that there are many predictable wind patterns that are caused by the rotation of the Earth in combination with the hot air rising at the equator and the colder air falling kind of further away, going kind of up in this region through here. And again, this gives rise to predictable patterns of air that, again, we can use to harness that energy, harness the power of the wind in some way. Now, when I was in 7th grade, I read a great book by Thor Heyerdahl on the Kon-Tiki expedition. And this was Thor Heyerdahl was a Norwegian ethnographer, basically oversimplified a little bit, a cultural anthropologist. So he studied different cultures. And when he was doing that, he was interested in seeing similarities between cultures from very distant regions across the planet. And he came up with this theory that maybe we would see like colonization of the Polynesian islands from people coming from South America. And at that time, the Kon-Tiki expedition was in 1947. People said, you're basically crazy. That doesn't make sense. Nobody could make it all the way from Peru out to the Polynesian islands. And so what Thor Heyerdahl did is he, went up into the mountains of Peru, cut down some balsa trees, created this balsa log raft, and set sail. And again, because of the wind and the currents that are present there, he was able to take off from Peru and sail, and I can't remember, I think it was 3 or 4 months, ultimately get all the way over to the Polynesian islands. A few years later, in 1969 and 70, he tested that hypothesis again because he saw kind of similarities with some of the Egyptian kind of activities and monuments and cultural aspects were kind of repeated in areas of South America. And so in 1969, 1970, he put together these papyrus boats and set off from Morocco. So basically kind of went all the way through the Mediterranean Sea, started out here within the Atlantic, and then ultimately on one of those expeditions, he actually had two of the raw expeditions, made it over to one of the islands over here in the area of Barbados. And so in that case, we're looking at wind power helping to move people, helping to move cultures in a predictable pattern. And we saw that kind of extending out towards the great sailing ages, where the movement of the wind currents will allow sailing to occur from one continent to another. So if we look at actually applying this wind energy into a kind of another form of usage for human beings, what we can see is that there have been variations of windmills in use for over 2,000 years. And so here we've got here we've got an example of a classical European windmill, large sails being present. They're going to catch the wind, and as the wind is kind of moving across it, it's going to cause these sails to wind, these blades to turn in relationship to the wind. And those blades are going to be attached to a series of structures inside, which ultimately are going to cause these wheels to spin. And so we can see, in a water mill, we'd have water kind of moving these blades, kind of causing these stones to move in relationship to one another, and they're going to grind, different grains into flour or meal. Same basic idea with the windmills, but instead of water, we've got the wind moving the blades, moving these windmills. It's going to propel the structures inside to cause these stones to spin. And as these stones spin, they're going to grind the grain into some aspect of flour. Another example of that in the United States is that a variation of the windmill, this much smaller windmill, these American windmills are going to be smaller. Starting in about the 1880s, they were being used to pump water from deep underground. In the Great Plains areas, they were subject to, flooding rains, but then long periods of droughts with limited access to surface water. And because of that, the Great Plains regions of the United States at that time were often referred to as the Great American Desert because they would have these very long periods of droughts, and then the sunlight and the wind would cause the surface water to dry up, so they wouldn't have access to it. And so homesteaders, farmers, and ranchers began to use these windmills. And again, the American windmill, much smaller than the European windmill, much less expensive, and basically with a design that they could be manufactured, shipped, and then assembled in a region. And so we can see, again, a much smaller windmill here kind of in the middle, an old advertisement being present here. And you can see the scale. You've got a cow here, a couple of people on horses kind of nearby. So relatively small, but it's helping to pump the water into this trough being present here. Allowed for the settling of the Great Plains. We also saw windmills kind of along railroads throughout the American West. Same basic idea. We would hook up a windmill onto a well, and so as that wind would flow there, it caused the windmill to spin. This would cause a pumping action to occur, and we would fill up these reservoirs kind of along the rail line. And so again, keep in mind that at that period of time, the 1800s, the trains were locomotives. The trains were steam powered, and so they were using either coal or wood to heat up a burner of water. That water would be converted into steam, and that steam energy would cause the train to move forward. That works really well if you've got coal, and they usually have a hopper which is going to be behind it full of coal or full of wood if they're going to be a wood-burning train. Usually coal was used more extensively. It was a better source of energy. But when you run out of water, you run out of the possibility of steam. And so you would have to stop periodically along the rail line and refill the water that's going to be present there so that you could go that next stretch. And so the American windmill then was very, very important for both the settling of the Great Plains from a standpoint of homesteaders, farmers, and ranchers. And it was also important for the railroads kind of moving out into that region as well. Now, going into the 20th and 21st century, we're not looking at this as a primary source of railway, water. We're not using steam engines, we're using diesel engines now at this point. But we're interested in producing electricity. And so what we've done is basically kind of modify those windmills. In this case, we've got a large wind turbine here. So same basic idea. We've got these long blades that are present that are going to catch the wind, and as they catch the wind, they're going to spin. And then within the internal kind of machinery of this wind turbine, it's called a turbine now as opposed to a windmill, because it's going to be used for the generation of electricity. We're going to be spinning a little generator. And so like a hydroelectric plant, you'd have water spinning the turbines, causing a generator to spin wires within kind of a magnetic field. Same basic thing here. We're going to spin wires within a magnetic field, and that's going to generate electricity. And it's the rotation of the wind blades here, the rotation of this turbine, that is going to cause that spinning, and it's going to cause a generation of electricity. And when we take a look at this, just basic properties of wind, is that overall the movement of the wind tends to be much higher at higher elevation. I want to say elevations, higher up within the atmosphere. And so an example here, looking at tower height going from 0 to about 150 feet on this scale, we can see that shorter windmills or wind turbines are going to have a decent amount of energy. They have the potential to produce a decent amount of electricity if we put it there. But if we go to much taller and taller and taller structures, they are able to generate a lot more energy because they have access to a lot more wind speed, a lot more wind power associated with it. And that's the reason why you see that many of the large industrial wind turbines are located on very tall shafts to put them higher up to be able to collect that higher amount of wind power to spin our turbines and spin the generator to produce the electricity. Now, if we take a look at the wind electricity generation, and this is taking a look at it over a period of time from 2001 up to 2018, we've seen pretty good increase in the amount of wind generated electricity, with over half of that coming from areas kind of similar to the Great Plains region, where we saw the windmills allowing for the homesteaders to pump water. Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Kansas have great wind flowing throughout that region, and therefore are able to harness that reliable movement of the wind for the generation of electricity. Now, wind energy, is a potential source of green energy, a source of energy that is not contributing to the release of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, is a good thing. But like many, many things in the world, many, many things in science, we have to balance out the benefits with the risks. What are the advantages in relationship to the disadvantages? And one of the major concerns associated with these wind turbines is this fear, and there is evidence that birds and bats are at risk of colliding with the wind turbine blades. And so, there's this fear that if you put these wind turbines up in an area, especially in areas with large bird populations or kind of along flyways where birds are going to be migrating, they're going to be, in a position where they are going to come into contact with this, and in doing so, get killed, disrupt the migration pattern, and disrupt the movement and survival of these birds. A similar pattern with the bats too, and there are migratory types of bats that go along the same basic thing. Some statistics from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was put together by Statista. What we can see is that taking a look again at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service data, the majority of birds killed through anthropomorphic or at least human-based causes are caused by cats, are caused by our pets that are outside. Beyond that, other major sources are collisions with buildings in that area, as well as collisions with vehicles. If we take a look at it, collisions with wind turbines, and this is land-based wind turbines, we'll talk about offshore turbines in a second, there's still, pretty predominant number of birds that are being killed, and I don't mean to downplay that, but it's relatively low in relationship to all of the other causes. Now, keep in mind that this is always going to be an estimate because we don't have the ability to go through and determine exactly how many birds are killed within this region. We may not find all the carcasses, depending on how they're monitoring this. But again, it seems to be a major concern, but there are other risk factors as well. Now, in an effort to kind of minimize the risk of this, there have been a variety of scientific studies that have been done. In the first one, we take a look at an example over here on bats. And what they recognized here in this study is that bats tended to be flying around more when the wind was low. And basically what they did is in a study, they took these wind turbines and they basically set them so that if there were kind of low amounts of wind, kind of low kind of wind speeds being present, they would not allow the turbines, these wind blades, to start spinning at these lower wind speeds. And by doing so, they were able to decrease pretty significantly the amount of bats that were colliding with the turbine blades. And so there's this idea that if we do this on a more widespread basis, if you set these turbines so they don't kind of kick in at the low powers and possibly kind of limit the spinning of these turbine blades during periods of migration, we can very dramatically decrease the impact that the turbines would have on the bat populations. Similar study, I guess this was 2020, so this actually came out before the other bat study. There's a group in Europe, I think in this case, we're looking at, I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't. I'm not sure the country that this is done, but basically what they did here is they went through and painted one of the turbine blades black. So you'd have two that are relatively normal in color, probably white, one that is black, and just the presence of one black blade very dramatically reduced the collisions with the turbines, and so bird collisions. And so again, preliminary data now at this point, but there are ways in which, or appear would be ways in which we can decrease the risks of birds and bats colliding with these wind turbine blades, and hopefully we can implement some of those going forward to reduce the potential impact on bird and bat survival as a result of adoption of more wind power. Another complaint associated with turbines is they generate a lot of noise. And so in this case, we're looking at a geese study from 2013. And they looked at this relationship between the sound generated by these wind turbines and the geese population very close to the turbine and very further away. And what they saw was that geese that were basically growing up, living really close to the turbine, had problems. They had higher levels of stress hormones within their blood and lower body weight than a group of geese that was 500 meters away. So we're talking at the base of the turbine versus half a kilometer away. And so there appears to be a effect, at least on some animals. Hasn't been repeated in human beings. This is a 2014 systematic review that took a look at a lot of other studies on human health effects related to wind turbines. And what they said is that, yes, there is complaints of annoyance, self-reported sleep disturbance in association with these wind turbines, but it tended to be a dose response, and it tended to be in those individuals that were in very close proximity to a wind turbine. And they've done estimates about the amount of noise that the wind turbine is going to be generating. And what they've shown is that at a distance of about 300 meters, or about 1,000 feet, the wind turbines would be generating sound in the range of about 45 decibels. So, not to the point of, heavy metal music kind of pounding in your ears, but this low kind of constant thrum that's going to be present. And, I don't mean low as in, kind of like low, but, high enough that it, would impact on your ability to, have a conversation. In some cases, I saw that in a couple reports that, if you're standing right by a turbine that is running, it's loud enough to be definitely annoying. But if you go further out, if you go to a distance of about a 1 mile, most wind turbines become inaudible. And so the amount of noise generated is going to drop off very, very quickly the further away you get from it, which again indicates the importance of making sure we site these windmills in the most appropriate location to minimize their impact on both humans and animals. And then finally, or not finally, at least for the land turbines, there are a lot of concerns about the placement of this. And then there is one question about whether or not we should be placing these wind turbines, these wind farms, often referred to as wind farms, if you got a whole bunch of them together, on public land. And so if we take a look at public land managed by the U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management, we see that the Bureau of Land Management already leases mineral rights. And so you can get a lease and start mining for minerals, or you can get a lease and try to develop and extract oil or natural gas from the land. And so there's this feeling that these public lands would be a good location for these wind turbines, so these wind farms, again, because they would be available to be placed in large tracts of open land, which in general are going to be located away from populated areas, and so minimize the impact on humans, potentially living within that region. Now, again, like we see in a lot of areas, there are some benefits that are going to be to doing that, but then there are some risks. Should we be, disrupting the kind of natural environment to put these wind turbines kind of along a ridgeline? It's kind of hard to see on this news report over here, but you're going to see kind of along the top of a ridge over here, again, because that's going to be the location where you're going to be getting good, solid flow of wind so that you get reliable production of energy in this way. So lots of concerns about the placement of these wind turbines on land. So one alternative that's been proposed is to look at offshore wind products. And this is basically putting these either anchored to the ocean's floor, or there are some designs where they're actually kind of free floating, but then using anchors to be held in place. But taking a look at the wind turbines. This is very, very prominent when you take a look at Europe, much less so in the United States, at least at this point. The Biden administration in 2021 is looking at jump-starting offshore wind energy projects in an effort to build more renewable energy sources for the United States, as well as the production of clean energy jobs. But again, lots of benefits to putting them offshore, but there are some potential disadvantages or risks associated with it. A 2022 National Academy of Sciences consensus report has indicated that wind turbine generator does have some impact, same risks associated with migratory seabirds, depending upon where the placement is. But it does appear to have some impact on a marine vessel ship radar. And so the movement of the blades can cause a slight Doppler effect, which would interfere with the ship's radar, cause it to kind of see things that may not necessarily be there. The high amount of metal within this region and the production of electricity can generate kind of interference, which would make it difficult for boats kind of in that close proximity to these wind turbines for having their radar to be operating properly, and at least in search and rescue operations to be able to find a ship in distress. And so again, benefits, but there are disadvantages as well. And so if we take a look at this gives rise to the question for today, this ethical dilemma in science question. What criteria should be used in deciding the placement of a wind turbine? Does it matter if we're taking a look at putting this on private versus public lands? How much of an impact should be considered on the placement in relationship to humans and animals? Ideally, we're going to get away from using fossil fuels that are contributing to atmospheric carbon, that are causing climate change and kind of disruption of the environment. So we want to be doing that. But, is there a need to, kind of protect the visual aesthetics? You go out into, the public lands and you want to see nature. You don't necessarily want to see kind of a big kind of wind turbine. Is that a consideration that should be there? Or should we just recognize that, if we are going to be dependent upon technology and dependent upon having lots and lots of energy available to us to power our lives, then maybe, we have to accept that we need to have these sources of energy that are going to be out there. And we need to accept the impact of these energy production sites as well. Does it matter if we're taking a look at onshore sites where it's going to be someplace we see, or should we be taking a look at offshore sites where we can put it out in the ocean, potentially far enough out that it may be below the horizon line, so that if you're on the beach, you're not necessarily going to see it, or at least if it's out there far enough, it's not really going to have that kind of visual impact that you want. Kind of in that out of sight, out of mind concept. Are there other factors that we should be considering in the decision as to where to place these wind turbines? And if there are other factors, what would they be? And so lots of different things that we should think about. Ideally, we will be pursuing better aspects of green energy. Ideally, we are going to be looking at implementing more generation of electricity using these wind turbines. But hopefully we're going to be able to do so in a way that's going to, kind of reduce the risks associated with bats and bird collisions. Place them in an area where we minimize the sound impact on humans and animals. Lots of decisions that need to be made in this effort to, provide the energy we need with more reliable and clean sources. I'll be posting additional information references I used I thought were valuable. If you would like to have additional information on this in the comments or the notes section below, so I'll be posting that. And as always, hopefully you enjoyed this ethical dilemma in science, and we'll be posting another one soon. So thank you and have a great day.